Las Vegas, late night, end of the 1960s, a sealed suite above the casino floor. No cameras, no music drifting up from below, no jokes to soften the edges. Across the table sits a man whose name never appears on posters, yet whose decisions determine which voices echo through this city, and which are quietly erased from it. Between them lies an envelope, thick, unmarked, heavy enough to change a lifetime. Inside, more money than most men will ever see, even if they do everything right. The offer is delivered calmly, almost with courtesy. We just need you not to say anything, ever. Dean Martin doesn't reach for it. He doesn't deflect with humor. He doesn't perform. He looks straight at the man and answers without raising his voice. So controlled, so final, that the room itself seems to stiffen. In that moment, the deal dies. Not with a refusal, with something far more dangerous. Because this isn't a story about cash or contracts. It's about a line that, once crossed, costs more than silence. And a man who refuses to let anyone decide where his ends. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas in the early 60s ran on certainty. Not luck, not spectacle. Certainty. Every night had to look identical from the casino floor. Lights warm, drinks steady, smiles predictable. The city sold the idea that nothing here ever slipped out of control. And to keep that illusion intact, it needed voices that never cracked and faces that never surprised anyone. A singer wasn't just a headliner. He was insurance. Residencies weren't booked for talent alone. They were calculated. A familiar name on the marquee meant the rooms upstairs would fill, the tables downstairs would stay busy, and the wrong people would feel calm enough to keep their hands in their pockets. Casino executives didn't talk about stability out loud, but everyone understood it. Music was part of the infrastructure, like air conditioning or security. You didn't notice it when it worked. You noticed immediately when it didn't. Dean Martin understood this arrangement better than most. He arrived on time, left when the set was done, and never blurred the line between the stage and the machinery behind it. He didn't ask how decisions were made, didn't linger where money changed hands, didn't confuse access with entitlement. That wasn't fear. It was discipline. In a town built on indulgence, restraint made him dependable. People mistook that for softness. Backstage, he was known for one thing. He didn't complicate matters. No shouting, no scenes, no public grievances. If something felt off, he logged it away and kept moving. The casinos valued that. Predictable men were easier to schedule than brilliant ones. Dean gave them both, without asking for anything extra, which is why the first comment stood out. It came after a late show, spoken lightly by a man who didn't introduce himself. No office, no clipboard, no urgency. Just a casual observation, delivered while the applause was still fading somewhere beyond the curtain. "You're around more than most," the man said, as if complimenting a work ethic. Then, softer. "Sometimes it's better not to be." Dean smiled the way he always did. Easy, practiced, uninformative. He didn't ask what the man meant. In Vegas, questions were louder than refusals. A few days later, another adjustment. A suggestion, really. Someone mentioned it might be simpler if Dean skipped certain corridors, avoided certain late-night overlaps. Not a rule, just advice, offered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being followed without resistance. None of it was framed as a warning. That was the point. Threats created noise. Noise attracted attention. Vegas preferred frictionless corrections. Dean noticed the pattern immediately. He had spent enough years around powerful men to recognize when courtesy became choreography. The rules hadn't vanished. They were being revised, quietly, without his signature. He didn't bristle. He didn't push back. On stage, nothing changed. The tempo stayed relaxed. The jokes landed where they always had. The room leaned forward on cue. To the audience, he looked untouched by the city's undercurrents. That was part of the job. But privately, he recalibrated. He knew what he'd seen over the years: small exchanges, private favors, faces that disappeared between seasons. He'd never spoken about them, not because he'd been asked to stay silent, but because the silence had always belonged to him. It was his choice, his line. Now someone was hinting that the line was no longer his to draw. Dean didn't rush to interpret it as danger. Vegas didn't move that fast. First came the atmosphere, then the implication, then, only if necessary, the offer. He understood the sequence. What unsettled him wasn't the suggestion that he step back. It was the realization that the city was checking whether he still knew his place, or whether it needed to remind him. The invitation arrived without stationery, without urgency. A time, a location, nothing else. Not a casino, not a hotel suite, not anywhere that suggested ownership. A quiet restaurant on the edge of the Strip that prided itself on being forgettable. Neutral ground. The kind of place people chose when they wanted the meeting to dissolve the moment it ended. Dean arrived alone. The man waiting for him stood when he entered, polite enough to seem harmless. No ring, no visible security, no name offered. They exchanged a handshake that lingered half a second too long. Not dominance, not familiarity, just calibration. Both were measuring weight. They talked first about irrelevant things, attendance numbers, how well the season had been going, how rare it was, these days, to find someone who never embarrassed the room. The compliments were accurate, which made them more effective. Flattery only worked in Vegas when it didn't exaggerate. Then the tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. The man spoke about appreciation, about how some contributions couldn't be reflected in contracts or billing statements, about how discretion had its own value, especially when exercised consistently. He never referenced a specific moment, never described an incident. The conversation stayed forward-looking, as if the past had already been settled. A slim envelope appeared on the table, placed carefully, aligned with the edge. It wasn't pushed toward Dean. It was simply introduced into the space, like a third participant. "This isn't about anything you've done," the man said calmly. "It's about keeping things uncomplicated." Dean didn't touch the envelope. He didn't lean back or cross his arms. His face stayed neutral, the expression of someone listening to a weather report that might affect travel plans. The explanation continued, smooth and unhurried. Some artists preferred guarantees. Others valued flexibility. Vegas rewarded both, as long as expectations stayed aligned. Residencies evolved. Audiences changed. Nothing here was permanent, not even success. The city moved forward with or without sentiment. Names surfaced briefly. Performers who had once anchored rooms now remembered vaguely, if at all. No accusations, no cautionary tales, just facts, delivered without drama. Careers didn't end in Vegas. They simply relocated, sometimes without announcement. The amount inside the envelope was substantial, more than courtesy, enough to suggest continuity, enough to make refusal inconvenient. Dean registered all of it, the care in the phrasing, the absence of coercion, the way every sentence left room for plausible denial. This wasn't a payoff, it was an alignment check. The man smiled again, softer now. "Think of it as gratitude," he said, "for understanding how things work." For the first time, Dean looked directly at him, not at the envelope, at the eyes behind the offer. There was no hostility there, only confidence, the kind that came from assuming the outcome had already been decided. Dean gave no answer. He finished his drink, thanked the man for his time, and let the silence stretch just long enough to become noticeable. When he stood to leave, the envelope remained exactly where it was. That, more than the money, clarified the situation. This wasn't a single conversation. It was the opening move in a longer arrangement, one that expected compliance without ever asking for it out loud. The silence lasted longer than politeness required, long enough for the clink of glasses from another table to drift into the space between them, long enough for the man across from Dean to realize this wasn't hesitation. Dean hadn't looked at the envelope once since sitting down. Not when it appeared. Not when the number inside was quietly implied. Money usually pulled the eyes first. Habit, reflex. This time, nothing. He studied the man instead. The posture, the controlled stillness, the kind of calm that came from speaking on behalf of something larger than oneself. Dean had seen it before, in studio negotiations, in closed-door conversations where the words mattered less than who could afford to wait. The man cleared his throat, almost imperceptibly. Not impatience. Adjustment. Dean finally spoke, and when he did, there was no preamble. "I don't sell silence," he said. His voice stayed even, untextured. Especially not silence that isn't mine to sell. That was all. No lecture, no moral framing, no reference to loyalty or dignity or lines that shouldn't be crossed. Just a statement of fact, delivered the way one might explain gravity. The meaning landed slowly, precisely because it wasn't dramatized. The man's expression shifted, not to anger, not yet. Something subtler. Calculation interrupted. He glanced at the envelope, then back at Dean. "This isn't about ownership," he replied carefully. "It's about mutual comfort." Dean shook his head once. Small. Final. "I'm comfortable," he said. The envelope stayed where it was, untouched, but its presence changed. It was no longer an offer. It was a test left unresolved. The man leaned back, his confidence thinning at the edges. For the first time, the conversation lost its script. "You should think about this," he said. The sentence was softer now, less polished. "People who last here understand when not to complicate things." Dean stood. The chair legs scraped quietly against the floor. He didn't adjust his jacket. Didn't reach for the envelope, not even to move it aside. He simply stepped around the table. "I already have," he said. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Dean turned and walked toward the door. No rush. No pause for effect. The kind of exit that didn't invite response. Behind him, the envelope remained on the table, exactly aligned, exactly where it had been placed. The man didn't call out. He didn't need to. The refusal hadn't embarrassed him. It had unsettled him. Outside, the night air felt unchanged. Vegas rarely reacted in real time. Dean knew that. This wasn't the end of a negotiation. It was the beginning of a consequence. The city wouldn't respond with anger. It would respond with adjustments. Quiet ones, schedules, access, tone. As Dean drove away, he didn't feel relief or triumph, just clarity. He hadn't challenged the system. He'd stepped out of its expected path. And systems, when ignored, didn't shout. They recalibrated. Nothing happened at first. That was the tell. The week after the meeting unfolded exactly as scheduled. Same stage door. Same orchestra call time. Same quiet nods from men who measured their days in routines. Vegas never rushed a response. Immediate reactions were for amateurs. Real pressure arrived dressed as coincidence. The first change came folded inside logistics. A revised performance calendar, delivered without comment. A show moved earlier, another trimmed by 10 minutes. Nothing that could be argued, nothing that looked punitive. Just adjustments, justified by foot traffic patterns and guest flow optimization. Words that sounded harmless enough to repeat without embarrassment. Promotion shifted next. Posters that once appeared near elevators didn't get replaced when they came down. A radio mention disappeared from the weekend rotation. No announcement, no explanation. Dean's name was still respected, just slightly less visible. He noticed the spacing backstage change before anyone said a word. Fewer casual overlaps. Conversations that used to pause comfortably now ended a beat early. People remained polite, even friendly, but the air thinned. It was the kind of distance that couldn't be accused of anything. Managers felt it first. They stopped making eye contact during scheduling talks. When Dean asked simple questions, he got careful answers. No one lied. They simply spoke around the truth, the way people did when honesty would cost them more than silence. Musicians sensed it without understanding it. The room before shows felt tighter, quieter. Jokes landed differently. Laughter ended faster. Dean never addressed it. He didn't reassure anyone. He watched. Then came the message. Not a call, not a letter. A comment passed along through two intermediaries, stripped of ownership by the time it reached him. Framed as concern. Delivered like advice from someone who wanted to remain helpful. In Vegas, the voice said, people don't like unnecessary complications. No name attached, no consequence outlined. Just a reminder of taste. Dean absorbed it without reaction. He had expected something like this. The system didn't punish defiance, it corrected inefficiency. The goal wasn't to hurt him. It was to see whether discomfort would do the work on its own. He adjusted nothing. He showed up early, sang precisely, left on time. He didn't counter-program or appeal to loyalty. That would have confirmed the problem. He let the quiet accumulate. The realization settled slowly. This wasn't isolation as exile. It was isolation as pressure. Reduce the surface area. Narrow the margin. Encourage self-correction. Dean understood the test. If he reached back out, the door would open. The offer would return, perhaps refined, perhaps improved. The system allowed reversals. It thrived on them. But he didn't move. He had lived long enough to recognize when resistance didn't need volume. Sometimes endurance was the refusal. Sometimes watching was enough. Vegas remained bright, efficient, courteous. Nothing about it looked hostile. That was the brilliance of it. And that was how Dean knew the real measure hadn't been applied yet. This was only the pause before the city decided whether he was still useful, or simply in the way. The night had thinned out by the time he left the stage. Not empty, Vegas never emptied, but quieter, the way a place sounded when its attention shifted elsewhere. Dean walked the familiar corridor toward his dressing room, the applause already absorbed into the walls behind him. He almost missed the man waiting near the service exit. Not security, not management, no jacket that signaled authority. Just someone who belonged to the building the way wiring and pipes did. Mid-40s, maybe older. Hands that carried the permanent trace of work. He stood too straight for someone trying to look invisible, which was how Dean noticed him. "Mr. Martin," the man said softly. Not a fan's voice. No excitement in it. Just caution. Dean stopped, but didn't invite him closer. "I won't take much of your time," the man continued. His eyes kept moving, not wildly, just enough to confirm exits, shadows, the absence of witnesses. "I shouldn't be talking to you at all." Dean waited. Silence was often safer than encouragement. "They asked me to make sure you didn't see certain things," the man said. "Not tonight. In general. He swallowed, then corrected himself. They didn't ask. They assumed. Dean nodded once. That tracked. The man shifted his weight. What happened with you? It wasn't personal. It's a structure. Been running a while. Dean studied him more carefully now. This wasn't bravado. This was someone who had rehearsed every word and still feared misplacing one. How many? Dean asked. The man hesitated, then exhaled. Enough. He spoke in fragments, careful not to connect dots too explicitly. Similar meetings, different locations, always clean, always framed as appreciation. Most people took the money. Some didn't. The ones who didn't stay long. Not fired, not banned, just removed from circulation. Their names faded quietly from schedules, then from memory. Dean listened without interruption. They're not worried you'll talk, the man said finally. His voice dropped further, almost into himself. They're worried you won't. Dean looked at him sharply now. The man met his gaze, then looked away. Silence that belongs to them is safe. Silence that belongs to you. That's unpredictable. The corridor hummed faintly with distant machinery. No footsteps, no voices. Just infrastructure doing its job. I don't want anything, the man added quickly. I don't want to be part of this. I just needed you to know why they won't stop. Dean considered him. This wasn't a plea. It was a confession, offered by someone who needed the weight off his chest more than he needed protection. You should forget we spoke, Dean said. The man nodded immediately. Relief flashed across his face, then vanished, replaced by caution again. Already trying. He stepped back, then turned down the service hall, disappearing into the building's unseen arteries. Dean remained where he was for a moment longer. The situation had shifted. Before, he'd had instinct and principle. Now he had confirmation. The system wasn't improvising, it was maintaining equilibrium, and his refusal hadn't disrupted it. It had exposed it. For the first time, Dean understood the threat clearly. Not to him, but from him. As long as he stayed exactly as he was, the system had to account for a variable it couldn't absorb. And variables made powerful people uneasy. He adjusted his jacket and walked on, aware that the most dangerous part of the story hadn't happened yet. It was still deciding how cleanly it wanted to end. The decision arrived the way weather changes do in the desert, without drama, without warning, already complete by the time you noticed it. Dean was informed through routine channels, wrapped in language polished smooth enough to leave no fingerprints. The residency would not continue. No confrontation. No dissatisfaction expressed. The phrasing leaned on trends, on renewal, on the city's appetite for rotation. New faces, fresh energy. The kind of explanation that sounded reasonable precisely because it couldn't be argued. It didn't accuse him of anything. It simply moved past him. Nothing else changed. No contracts were torn up. No musicians dismissed. His name remained spoken with respect. That was the elegance of it. The system didn't need to humiliate him. It needed to reposition him. Within days, the narrative found its way outward. A soft leak, framed as insight rather than announcement. Dean Martin is stepping back from Vegas. The sentence traveled easily. It suggested choice without granting agency. It implied timing without revealing authorship. Phones rang. Familiar voices checked in, carefully neutral. No one asked questions that required answers. Support, when it came, arrived stripped of verbs. Everyone understood the cost of enthusiasm. Then the intermediary returned. No envelope this time, no pleasantries. Just the same calm presence, now less formal, as if formality itself had been exhausted. You've earned a graceful exit, the man said. That matters. Dean listened, his face unreadable. You can shape the ending, the man continued. One final appearance. Your terms. The city thanks you. Everyone moves on. And if I don't? Dean asked. The man shrugged slightly. Then time does it for you. That was the lever. Not fear, not pressure, reputation. The chance to control how the story closed, rather than let it taper into ambiguity. They weren't asking him to disappear. They were offering authorship, conditional authorship. Dean understood the temptation. He could walk away intact, applauded, preserved. He could accept the version of events being prepared for him and live comfortably inside it. What unsettled him wasn't the loss of the residency. It was the quiet attempt to define his absence, to suggest retreat where there had been none, to let silence be mistaken for consent. He didn't answer immediately. He asked for time. That night, alone, he weighed the cost. Not in money, in legacy. He had spent years crafting a presence that looked effortless because it was disciplined. Letting others narrate its conclusion felt like a final concession. By morning, the decision had clarified. He wouldn't argue. He wouldn't expose anyone. He wouldn't correct the record with statements or bitterness. He would accept a single condition and make it his. When he called back, his voice was steady. One last show, he said. No promotion, small room, and when I leave, it's because I choose to. There was a pause on the line, then agreement. The system believed it had won something. It always did at this stage. What it hadn't accounted for was how dangerous dignity could be when given a microphone one final time. The room held fewer people than any place he had played in years. No banners, no cameras angling for reaction shots, no sense of occasion beyond what the audience carried in themselves. Word had traveled quietly, the way meaningful things often did in Vegas, through trust, not promotion. Dean stepped onto the stage without announcement. No joke opened the night. No easing into familiarity. He stood still for a moment, letting the room finish adjusting to his presence. What followed wasn't the repertoire that had built his legend. The arrangements were restrained, the tempos slower. Songs chosen not for charm, but for truth. Lyrics that left space between lines. Melodies that didn't rush to reassure. He sang as if nothing needed proving. The audience leaned in, not because they were instructed to, but because the performance demanded it. This wasn't nostalgia. It was clarity. A man refusing to decorate his exit. Between songs, he didn't speak much. When he did, it was plain. Gratitude, expressed without flourish. No acknowledgments of history, no hints at conflict. Just presence, complete and unprotected. Those who listened closely heard what wasn't being said. The restraint carried its own weight. There were no accusations to refute, no statements to reframe, nothing for anyone to contest. That was the point. At the end of the set, he stepped forward once more. The room waited, uncertain whether applause was appropriate yet. He let the quiet stretch. "Thank you," he said. "This is my last show in Vegas. My decision." No explanation followed. He didn't bow, didn't linger. He stood there long enough for the words to settle, then longer still, until understanding replaced surprise. When he finally turned away, the applause came. Not loud, not explosive, but sustained. Respectful. Earned. Backstage, there were no speeches, no congratulations, just handshakes, nods, eyes that understood what had happened, even if they couldn't articulate it. Dean walked out the same way he always had, alone, unhurried, complete. The city absorbed the moment without protest. There was nothing to contest. No rule broken, no scandal ignited. The system couldn't respond, because it had nothing to correct. In the days that followed, the narrative held. He had stepped back. The city moved on. New names appeared on marquees. The machinery continued. But something remained unsettled. Those who had been present understood the difference between disappearance and departure. Dean hadn't been erased. He had removed himself, cleanly, without permission. He hadn't exposed anyone. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply refused to let silence be assigned to him. And in a city built on control, that kind of quiet autonomy carried a resonance that outlasted applause. Not victory, not defiance, just a man leaving on his own terms and taking the meaning of his silence with him.